Okay, on to the next. We now have readings on modernism, edited by Shukla Sawant. Shukla Sawant is a visual artist and is currently an associate professor of visual studies. Oh, sorry, of visual studies at the School of Arts and Aesthetics, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. After graduating in painting from the College of Art, she specialized in printmaking at the Ecole des Beaux Arts, Paris, and later went on to the Slade School of Art and Centre for Theoretical Studies, London, on a Commonwealth grant. Shukla has 10 shows to her credit and has published various catalogue essays and contributed chapters to edited volumes on contemporary Indian art. She was a working group member of Khoj International Artists Association for 7 years and taught at the Fine Arts Department of Jamia, Millia, Islamia before joining JNU. And yeah, hello Shukla.
So I have the PowerPoint there.
Should I start it?
I'll put it up.
Okay.
So thank you, Marg, for putting this seminar together. And also my thanks to IIC for providing the venue and all of you for turning up today. I'll just go into my slideshow. Okay. So when you look at the journal Marg, it was one of the earliest English standalone journals on modernism, on art. Of course, we have had earlier journals. For instance, if you look at Modern Review, which was a journal that was initiated in 1907 by Ramanand Chatterjee. It was a journal that carried articles on art, but it was not a standalone journal. So the first such journal was perhaps a Rupam in English. Later you had another journal that came out in the 1920s called Kala, which came out of an institution called Kala Mandira in Bangalore. This is an institution that started the same year as Shantiniketan. And then later you had Rooplekha again in the 1920s. This is the cover from 1954. It's a journal that was brought out by the All India Fine Arts and Crafts Society. After 1946, of course, there have been many other journals, Art Trends, for instance, that came out of Cholamandalam. It is a journal that was, in some sense, a parallel platform for artists from down south, because, as mentioned earlier, Marg did have many gaps. It did not, for instance, cover artists from down south at all, because it was decidedly located in Bombay. It covered largely modernist movements from the metropolitan cities of Bombay and Calcutta, not even Delhi for that matter. Now, of late, there have been many volumes that have come out that have questioned the linear trajectory of modernism, and also the fact that most histories of modernism have largely been Eurocentric, or they've looked at the kind of arc between the Americas, that to North America, not even Latin America, and Europe. And even the most recent volume, Art Since 1900, which came out 2 decades ago, again focuses on the same trajectory. But now you have people like Ellen O'Brien who have questioned this model of art history writing and have looked to see the networks that existed from the 1920s, 30s, 40s onwards, especially from the 1950s, when a very different kind of a networked modernism emerged. Now, Marg, from its inception, was decidedly internationalist. Its editorial board was internationalist. Anil De Silva, who was Minette De Silva's sister, she worked for Marg. The kind of articles the journal carried, they carried articles of artworks from Russia, from, of course, France, but also from the South American countries. They also covered artists on the east side of the Iron Curtain. So not just artists from Western Europe, but also artists from the East Bloc. Now, when Navan gave me this monumental task of editing this volume, he said, look, we've got 5 months to put this together. This is the last volume of the financial year. And so you'd better get down to the job and just produce this, read 300 articles and put this together in 5 months. Luckily for me, the first set of books that we bought for the School of Arts and Aesthetics library when we started the school in 2001 was the set of Marg volumes. And our library perhaps is one of the few libraries in the country that does have almost the entire set of the early volumes. And I'd been digging through these journals, and I'd been, compiling articles for my students to get them to read, primary material, because by and large, if you look at the kind of art histories that were written till the 1980s and 90s, these are not really based on archival material. It's only people, who are historians really, people like Tapati, who are Thakur, etc., who started accessing primary material to write their art histories. And so this volume has both primary material, because this is material that runs parallel to how modernist movements were unfolding in India. And it also has articles that came out much later, because Marg had many gaps. It did not address many issues, and these were filled by writers who were invited to edit volumes, etc., much later. Now, it does have a kind of a temporal span. We started looking at art material, we started thinking of how we periodize modernism. It's something that's already been done historically. It's seen to be something that, started around the late 18th century, early 19th century, and the 1970s is about when we think of modernism as having come to a close in some sense, right? Of course, it had an extended life in many different ways, but this is the period that we were really looking at, and there are reasons for that. So, for example, the first section is called Colonial Modernity and Visual Representation. And it covers the period from late 18th century till about the early 20th century. The first section deals with soldier artists who came to India. And these soldier artists, in fact, are very interesting figures, because they were not the kind of art school trained artists who worked for princely courts in India, but rather they were trained to be embedded artists. And the reason why we started with this particular essay, which was written by Patricia Caterhorn, was that many of you might not know this, but when art schools started being initiated, or there was an intensification of building art schools in the mid-19th century, many of the people who actually came to teach in these art schools had worked as embedded artists in the British Army, say, for example, in the Crimean War. Joseph Archer Crowe, for instance, who was the first principal of the J.J. School of Art, had actually worked as an embedded artist for the Illustrated London News. So this is also the time when you had the first War of Independence, and so it's rather uncanny that almost all these figures who come are from that kind of a background. Now, you can see from the early articles in Marg, W.G. Archer was an important influence, and the kind of art history that he wrote in the 1950s of modernism in India, it begins with looking very skeptically at the revivalist artists of the Bengal school. He's very clear that this is revivalist. For him, that's a proto-modernist phase, and then modernism really begins with Rabindranath Tagore, right? But also, he wrote another book in the 1930s, I think, where he includes an illustration of Santhal painting within a kind of a modernist arc, because the rest of the artists in that book are French modernists, right? So the definition of modernism is being discussed at this point in time, clearly by the Marg editorial team. And so the earliest articles, as I said, really deal with this phase of experimenting with new technologies of representation. We have an article by Jeremiah Losty on Charles Doyle's lithographic press and his Indian assistants, because you have slowly and steadily a new, group of people taking up these new technologies of representation. So Shiv Dayal, for instance, he produced both these paintings that you see on the far side for the lithography press run by Charles Doyle. The issue of caste is again something that we found missing in the early volumes of Marg, but it was addressed later by later editors of the journal. So for instance, you have this article called Muchis, Gudigars and Other Chitrakars, a contribution to 19th century botanical art and science by H.J. Nolte. And this article is actually very interesting because it looks at the kind of drawings that are produced for botanical sciences, for the botanical gardens in Bengal, etc. But he's also very attentive to the class and the caste background of the artists who were contributing to these volumes, because they brought to bear in the kind of illustrations that they produced their own family skills, the kind that they had learnt through family transfer of knowledge. Similarly, Susan Bean's article looks at a completely different medium. It's again an article that appears fairly late in Marg's 75 years of production of art writing. Calcutta Banyas for the American Trade, portraits of early 19th century Bengali merchants, because the Americans who patronized clay sculpture in Calcutta came from a very different background. They were not part of the colonial bureaucracy. They were not East India Company officials. So many of these sculptures that they got made by Durga Puja idol makers were life-size, because these artists were in fact extremely adept at producing very realistic kind of representations. And these were taken back all the way to Boston. And these were forms of gifts. These were also forms of likenesses of traders that were produced so that the American counterparts could know what Indians looked like. Then something else happens in the early 20th century. You have people like Bhai Ram Singh, who came from an artisan background. He went on to become the head of the Lahore School of Art. We have a very interesting article in the journal by Sajida Vandal and Parvez Vandal, which looks at this remarkable figure by Ram Singh, who started out as a carpenter, acquired academic training in the art school, and also produced a number of really interesting illustrations for textiles and fabrics that were manufactured for the coronation darbars. Kali Bhatt paintings, of course, this article was a very early article. I put in the dates of the article so that you get a sense of when these issues were becoming important for the editors of Marg. And so you have this 1952 article on Kali Bhatt paintings, which again looks at the interface between different technologies of representation. It's an article that's subsequently been challenged and questioned by scholars like Jyotindra Jain. But the early kind of prejudices that went into the writing of these articles also are important for us to register. When we look at these, we get a sense of how modernist discourse was being read through this lens of being, a kind of a copy or just a kind of a, not very original in that sense. So these are just some images from what goes into the first section. There's another very interesting article, again from a fairly late period, fairly recent, by Dipali Diwan, A Tale of Two Mediums, Paint and Photography in Udaipur. So photography was another very important modern medium that came into India in the 19th century. It was introduced almost simultaneously in terms of its discovery. Just 10 years after photography was invented, it came to India. And here this article is very interesting because it looks at how photography is used for palace intrigues and how the fact that paint can produce realistic effects, but the layer or the pedimenti of photography underneath can actually give a certain kind of a realism to the image that's impossible to capture in painting. And so how that's quite often used in palace politics to show a monarch who's on his deathbed, but it's used to make him look more alive and, capable of ruling. The second section of the reader looks at responses to colonial art education. And so how does this form of art education change with interventions by, say, for example, the Gaikwad family in Baroda, right? What do they do with this form of documentation and the technical school education that's been introduced into Baroda in the 19th century? So Baroda at colonial exhibitions, it's a very interesting article by Priya Malloy Jardi, who has done a very, very detailed study of the archival material in Baroda to look at how, the Gaikwads were in fact creating this trademark called Baroda through and trying to distinguish themselves from the Bombay presidency, because normally in the early colonial exhibitions, Baroda used to be part of the Bombay presidency exhibitions, and how they were successful in establishing a separate trademark for themselves. Then again, this issue of applied art, because earlier the colonial schools, as you know, were created for providing education to the children of artisan communities who had lost work on account of the Industrial Revolution. But later you have another social strata enter into the art schools, and they are largely from Brahmin communities and upper caste communities, and they aspire to becoming fine artists who want to circulate their work through this emerging exhibition circuit, because the exhibition as a form is also something that emerges in the late 19th century, a secular space of display of artworks. And on the other hand, you also have in the early 20th century the figure of the architect, the designer, and the applied artist, or the designer that emerges through, again, the art school circuit, with the establishment of the commercial art department in the J.J. School of Art and the Government College of Art in Calcutta. And Tapati has done a very interesting study of commercial art versus craftsmanship. What does this term commercial art really mean in relationship to craftsmanship? And so here are a set of advertisements that were produced by art school trained artists, but now working within the field of applied art. And Tagore, of course, again, of course, Mulk is somebody who's championing the Bombay progressives, all the modernist movements, the early modernist movements. He's a great champion of these artists. And they are his contemporaries. So how does he write about them, right? Who does he promote? Who does he leave out? This becomes an important issue for us to study as well through this primary material. Rabindranath Tagore, Archer, in his book, positions him at the helm of modernism. Everything else before that is proto-modernism. And so, again, Tagore is somebody that Mulk champions over and over again through his journal. And some of the missing bits were, of course, as Naman has pointed out, there was virtually no reference to women artists working in Shantiniketan. There was almost nothing actually on the arts crafts movement as well, right? So we have Christine Michael's essay on the arts craft movement. And then also, Abanindranath Tagore is missing. He's missing because he's a revivalist, and he doesn't get mentioned in Marg till about the 1960s, when there's a special volume on sculpture, and then Abanindranath Tagore's Katum Kutum wood sculptures are included in the volume, right? So he gets no place whatsoever in Marg. Experiments in ceramics. This is, again, an essay by Hans Nauhaus, who with his brother, had set up a ceramic manufacturing facility in Java. And then subsequently in the 1940s, they migrate to Bengal and then have a very close relationship with what happens in Sriniketan. And the Calcutta group, we have Sanjay Malik sitting over here. This is a very seminal essay that came out in the early 1950s by Klaus Fischer, which is again on, this very important group of modernists from Calcutta. And then the Baroda Art School, which was just about shaping up in the 1950s. It's the first post-independence art institution to be set up. This does not really feature in the journal as an art school. The artists, of course, are covered from time to time, much later in the day, because most of the artists who go on to become extremely important to the history of Indian modernism are very young at this point in time. Their career is just unfolding. Ghulam Sheikh, Geeta Vivan later, Geeta, they all contribute essays later from the 1960s onwards, but they're not really covered. So we thought it was important to include this late essay by Ratan Parimu, Adventures in Art Education, N.S. Bendre and the Faculty of Fine Arts. It's a photo essay that we put into the, journal as a photo essay. And again, Devi Prasad Chaudhary, also because he helmed the art school in Madras, so it became important to understand his trajectory within the discourse of modernism. So these are just some illustrations from this section. You can get a sense of what you get here. It's also interesting to see the Calcutta group and its logo, the fact that here is a group that comes together and also feels it's important to establish its brand by getting a logo that, that's easy to recognize, right? So you have that over there, and the Abhinandan Tagore Katum Kutum illustration. Okay. The third section is titled Extending the Infrastructure for Art. Now, I don't know if some of you might have read this very interesting essay by Malvika Maheshwari that looks at this idea of the interim to examine the late 1940s and early 1950s, when just about every princely state is seeking support from Nehru's government to save their collection, right? And so they say, we want to give our collection to the public, we want to make it accessible to the public, etc. But Nehru is quite firm, and he says that no, this is a democratic state now, and I cannot really be spending my energy and funding on supporting princely collections, but let's build different kinds of institutions for a new nation, right? So this 1948 essay by Mulk Raj Anand is in fact very interesting. It's called Letter to an Englishman. It's a letter to a bureaucrat who is in charge of setting up institutions in England. And he's really pleading for a new kind of an institution to be built, something that will house art from all over the world, will not just have a very limited understanding of modernism or art for that matter, right? So as an essay and as a kind of an open letter, it's a kind of a challenge to the kind of institutions that existed in Britain, and he's asking for something completely different. This section has essays on Jamini Roy. It has, also an essay on Felix Topolowsky, because this is also the time when the Commonwealth is coming together. So there is this huge Commonwealth, fair in London. So the kind of paintings that were made for that by Felix Topolowsky. Amrita Shergill is here because it's a bequest of her paintings to the nation that leads to, in fact, the National Gallery of Modern Art in some sense coming into being, because we know that the National Museum, for instance, resulted from a large collection of sculptures and paintings that had been sent to the Burlington House Royal Academy exhibition in 1947-48, and that collection returned. So they had to build a new building. So you had a new building for an old collection, but you had the Jodhpur House, which was a relatively, it was already a building, and then you had a new collection of art, of modern art being housed in that. So we have Amrita Shergill in this section. We also have Jamini Roy, because he's establishing, again, an alternative way of functioning within a kind of a family structure. Trees and Open Spaces, it's a photo essay by Patrick Geddes, because he's somebody who's instrumental in shaping the environment in Shanti Niketan. He's an urban, planner, And so the kind of tree-lined avenues that you see in Shantiniketan that connect Sriniketan and Shantiniketan are in fact the result of his intervention. And what about the church, right? So we know, for instance, that someone like a Graham Sutherland in the 1930s was painting highly modernist representations of the crucifix. And these were, housed in churches. We know, for instance, that Sousa was also influenced by Graham Sutherland. But think of someone like an Angelo de Fonseca and Vamona Navalkar. There's a very interesting essay by Savia Vegas where she talks about how, in a kind of a modernist way, these artists too are, in some sense, breaking norms by introducing Indianized versions of the biblical story of the crucifix, right? So the sari-clad Madonna, or the dark-bodied Christ, etc. These are very modernist kind of ways of looking at religious subject matter. And we have, of course, artists like George Keat, etc., who have also been included in this. But there's another very interesting essay that I want to point out. This is an essay that was written in 1969 by Ashok Mitra, The Present State of Handicrafts. And by the 1960s, India has already been through several wars. Its economy is in a very fragile state. The government wants to intervene in the crafts sector. And so they do all these kind of surveys. But Ashok Mitra's article is very interesting because he's also making a case for modernist minimalism based on what he observes in rural communities. And he says that for a rural community, because resources are so less, it's important to design an object for its functionality and make it beautiful. And so ornament, in fact, is excessive and not needed at all, right? So the simple form that you see in village crafts quite often is the result of economizing on material, and how that produces its own kind of an aesthetics, which goes against ornamentation. You also have public-private interfaces. So the Jahangir Art Gallery comes in. Marg is completely, involved in projecting this new art space. Chandigarh is being built, so all the designs, the plans, the fact that it has a very interesting infrastructure of museums and art schools and also public art, all that is discussed in the journal. And you have also the Calico Museum of Textiles at Ahmedabad. The National Institute of Design is also being, is coming together in the 1960s. So the work of Charles Ames and Ray Ames, that's also highlighted in this journal. Typography exercises like this that, the National School of Design is, promoting, that is also designed over here, discussed over here. Then section 4 really focuses on something that's key to modernism, which is media-specific inquiries. And Marg would quite often have entire volumes that would be devoted to one specific medium. So a special volume on photography, for instance, right? Or another special volume on sculpture, or another special volume on graphic art, for example, right? So, so you have this section. And one of the most interesting debates that erupts is around the idea of sculpture. So some of you might know this, that the National Gallery of Modern Art, when it was inaugurated, the first thing that they did was, in fact, have a sculpture competition. And the Maquette for the Triumph of Labor, which the sculpture that now stands in front of the National Gallery of Modern Art, it's a work by D.P. Roy Chaudhary that won the competition. But there was another sculpture competition that took place at the international level called the, it was a competition called, that was initiated by the ICA, and it was, it asked for maquettes to honor the unknown political prisoner. So think of this subject matter, the unknown political prisoner. And there is this huge battle that rages through the pages of Marg. Mulk Raj Anand, being an internationalist, is in fact a member of the jury, right? And Pradosh Das Gupta, who's an artist of the Calcutta group, he submits a maquette, it's rejected. And so he goes into this rage and starts questioning what constitutes modern sculpture. He asks for the kind of parameters of a modernist sculpture to be defined. And so you have this kind of a back and forth between Herbert Reed, jury members, Pradosh Das Gupta, etc., that has, this debate has been enshrined in Marg. And NID has a very important role to play at this point in time. The artists there, like Dashrath Patel, etc., are experimenting with new forms of exhibition making, new technologies of exhibition making. So the tensile architectural structures, projections, etc. So all these modern kind of interventions are discussed in the journal. This is the Indian Pavilion that was designed by the faculty and students of the National Institute of Design, but was never realized and it did not get materialized because the government was too afraid to actually spend money on something experimental, and they went eventually at the Osaka World Fair, which was in fact a very experimental platform, which is where the Gutai artists in fact made some of the most interesting interventions. But what we got there was a very staid kind of a structure for the India Pavilion, but this didn't get realized. But also Nelly Mehta, Contemporary Weaves, this is an article by K.G. Subramanian, and again from the 1960s, this is from 1962. And so different kinds of materials are being discussed, etc. And then you have the fifth and the last section, which is assessing modernism. And here you have, different kinds of self-reflexive texts on modernism. So Mulk in the 1960s is discussing here the conversations that he had with Gandhi back in the 1930s about art, right? So he's in a kind of a reflexive mode here. Early article on by Hermann Goetz on Francis Newton Sousa. This happens to be his centenary, year, and neither the National Gallery of Modern Art nor the J.J. School of Art have celebrated his very important legacy. You also have judgment in the trial of Akbar Padamsi for alleged obscene paintings on art. This judgment was published in its entirety in the Marg Journal. Again, extremely important because it has helped save many artists thereafter in their kind of, when they've, breached government mandated ideas of propriety. Anyway, but the journal, as I said, also had, it covered Mexican art, it covered artists from different parts of the world quite regularly. And there's a very interesting one intervention that I want to point out, which is an article in 1962 by Tristan Zara called Homage to Africa, around the time when the whole Pan-African movement was coming together. And Africa became a very important kind of reference point to the way the discourse around decolonialism shaped up after that. And it ends, my volume on modernism really ends with an essay by Geeta Kapoor, Contemporary Indian Art, 1960s. It's an essay that is written in the wake of an exhibition, 2 decades of American painting traveling to India, which generated a lot of heat and debate. And by that time, Mulk Raj Anand had become the institution to rebel against. So if modernism is about rebellion, Mulk was at the helm of the Lalit Kala Academy and the Triennale. And so you have this young generation of artists, critics, writing against this institutional presence of Mulk. And so that's the last essay. But we also have a lot of images in the volume. We have, interspersed all the essays, etc., with various images of artists. You have this image of Janaki Ram, which is actually from one One volume that Marg eventually brings out is on modern Indian sculpture, which is edited by Shivji Panikar much later in 2000, I think. So, that's really where artists from the South get addressed, and, their work gets included in the Marg archive. So these are just some pages from that archive. And exhibitions, because there were lots of exhibition reviews that Marg carried. And so this is again an archive of the different kinds of exhibitions that were unfolding in mainly Bombay and Delhi that were covered by Marg. So it also provides us an archive of what was happening in the exhibition space. So with that brief introduction, I'm open to questions. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Shukla. It was no joke. Handling this enormous amount of material, I think you had more than 300 odd articles to wade through and look at. I think the largest body of material in Marg probably deals with the modern. But as you can see, this was also a tightrope. What I think Shukla hasn't explained enough was that, when you're a student who comes to study the field, you want to know, okay, who are the top artists of India? I need to know my Ram Kinkar Paid, my Amrita Sherkar, my M.F. Hussain, my this one, my that one. You want to know about the names. And at the same time, we need to go beyond the names and the biographies of these artists, and we want to be able to talk about so many other issues that modernism itself is implicated in, and the history of modernism is implicated in. So again, editorially, the photographs that she mentioned at the end, and how they had to be worked into the narrative with what purpose. And of course, we were limited. We had to work with the Marg archive. We couldn't cover everything in an ideal way because the archive doesn't have certain things. So that was a really commendable job in which this bumper volume came together. And it was great to be able to deal with the conversations that happened around it. I'd be happy to address questions. I don't know if you have that asked Shukla if is there. So another thing that's very good about this volume, please pass the mic, is that there was an interesting thing that both the editors of the volume on traditional Indian painting, Yael Rice and Dipti Khera, and Shukla Sawant, both wanted in chapter 1, her chapter 1, and their last chapter, wanted some of the same articles for both the volumes. And that was very interesting to see the centrality of certain studies that were forcing this overlap and this continuity, that there was a history that could actually be traced across the different volumes. So that was very good to be able to for us to be able to see that and how one could reference the other and look at the interconnections.
Yeah, especially I remember even the dance volume, like we wanted to carry all those line drawings and we couldn't because the dance
volume had done that. So, I was thinking about, because somebody raised that as a question earlier today, and textiles in dance. Oh yeah, you have. And, so there was a lot of this overlap that we were dealing with. Sorry, there was a...
The mic is on. Yeah. So thank you for all the presentations that have happened.
It's not on.
One. So
yeah, now.
yeah. Audible? Yeah. So I was just saying that thank you for putting this together, and I've loved all the presentations so far. My question is not particularly to this volume, but since I have been throughout, I mean, the 3-4 presentations that have happened. One question is that I'm curious why you chose NID as a venue for this activation, right? Because you mentioned embodiment, and then you mentioned theory, right? But I come from visual arts, right? I've done my bachelor's, I've done my master's, and the theory embodiment practice divide is already stark enough, right? So I'm also wondering, there are many institutions, let's say, I'm just going to talk about strictly the Delhi context, there are many institutions which intersect quote unquote theory and art, but don't do it, it's a half-baked attempt, right? Or there are selective stoppages, or there are things which, might not be reconciled or have not been thought enough for, let's say, the last 5 decades, right? So I'm curious about that one, that's the first one. And then the second question is, I'm also wondering when we're thinking of reimagining the curriculum, right? And I really hope that this doesn't come across from a place of cynicism, but a genuine curiosity, because I'm still trying to place who is this reader placed to words, right? Because, and this is meant in no offense, even the demographic of this room, right? And the conversations we are having, and the place I come from, let's say, for instance, pedagogically, even if this is out there, it doesn't seep in, yeah? So it doesn't seep in those institutions where, let's say, a large chunk of practitioners, visual art practitioners, for instance, I'm just going to talk about visual art practitioners since that's where I come from, they come from, right? So it doesn't seep in. So then I'm just wondering if it's just about putting it out, or also thinking of methods that can actually, kind of, for them to seep in, because it doesn't reach there anyhow, yeah? So even if we are thinking of reimagining the curriculum here, it's also a methodological crisis, at least in my opinion, that how does it reach there?
In the pedagogy of the fine arts departments.
Yeah. For instance, I mean, strictly talking about that, I'm not sure about other disciplines, so I won't comment. So yeah, I mean, those are the 2 questions I have.
Thanks. Yeah, which is why one of the reasons why we started the conversation at NID was precisely because of this reason. Because we wanted to be able to see how practitioners will start responding and start understanding that why they need to start looking at this material, how much easier can we make it? Like, what can we do to be able to start reaching out? There is a requirement to be able to do so. And I think artists who are interested in the field of reading and positioning their works, even very sharply theoretically positioned works, oftentimes are far ahead of the curve of what the professors of art history might be doing in their departments. And they are quite au fait with the latest theories and writings and art historical discourse. It's not that the artists are unaware of it. So those artists who want to be aware of it, I think, are aware of it. The problem has been more in the vocationally oriented colleges, which are in the NEP positioning of looking at design and applied art as being done for a market and utility purpose, and not leaving the curriculum enough time for students to be able to read. I think those departments are facing greater difficulties in figuring out how to work with this integration much more. And I think the problems that a NIFT and an NID will encounter are even greater than the problems that might be encountered by a fine arts program that still has a lot of space for art history per se. So that was one of the things. Who is the curriculum, this reader guided toward? Ultimately, I think it's a larger plea for the social sciences to be able to take visual culture far more seriously. And visual culture needs to be not just coming to it from things like temple art and architecture, which are very much part of the curriculum already, or Mughal painting, which will be our last presentation on ways of thinking about painting. But I think to also expand those to be able to look at other material. And modern Indian history has very little to do with modernism as we understand it in the art world and what we do. And the curriculum for the history departments that have to deal with, don't adequately deal with it. It's surprising that in India, the Guernica is still talked about in the curriculum for history, but so many other aspects of Indian modernism and the debates that are fully integrated into that don't feature in the modern history curriculum at all. So I think there is a balanced redressal that is required in the social sciences.
So I'd like to say, I went to an art school that, and Atul was sitting here, that simply did not teach art history, at least the time when we were there, as it should have been taught to us. And it's something that I developed an interest for much later on my own. Also because I was lucky that in my MA, I had someone like a Kavita Singh come and teach me briefly, and that's how I realized what art history could do and help me through my own practice, because I am a studio practitioner as well, right? But the new kind of programs that have started, whether it's the one that's at the Ambedkar University or Shiv Nadar, elsewhere as well, these are very theoretically informed courses, and the artists who are coming out of these programs are producing really brilliant work.
Just one thing, wanted to know, any reason, or I don't know about the last lecture, but I don't think it's based on this, any reason for not including cinema or popular culture, which is a very, very integral part of our trajectory?
Yeah.
And I was thinking, Shukla, you might have added photography, just the coming of it, but what happened to cinema, theatre? Theatre has been such an integral part of our...
So that issue
yeah.
does have a section on documentary photography. So one of the articles deals with documentary photography. And so the popular or the commercial is something that we bring in through Tapati's article. So, and we were only looking up to the
we could have done
1970s.
much more with popular and all of that. We have we can do that. Theatre, I'm afraid the Marg archive is not good on.
Yeah.
We don't have great articles on theatre, so we can't presume to come up with a reader on something like theatre. Cinema, we do have stuff. Yes, we do have stuff.
But that's not archival material. Those are recent volumes
More
that
recent.
are looking to fill the gaps that Marg didn't cover in its accepted history.
Something like this, it would be just nice to have maybe had a couple of articles which would give us a sense of where we went or where we are going. Just a thought, maybe, I don't know, if I'm on the right track.
Popular culture, though, certainly. Yes, the questions here. Yes.
Getting late with the
Thank you. As an arts educator and also a teacher, I have students who go first to the internet to find stuff, okay? Of course, I mean, sort of Wikipedia, for the young ones, that's a go-to place. But they also go to JSTOR, they go to academia, they go to Internet Archive, and nowhere there is Marg. Nowhere. So you have to buy the books.
Yeah.
Or you have to go to the website and you have to pay to read the article.
Yeah.
And students don't want to. 16-year-olds, 18-year-olds do not want to pay.
Yeah.
So how will Marg make it more accessible for,
Thank you for
the
asking.
young students
And
to
I'm
access
so
these
glad this
things?
matter is coming up on record and has been articulated. So I'm pleased to inform you that at a meeting with the trustees of Marg held 3 months ago, it has been minuted and decided the entire Marg archive up until 5 years back, and anything that's within the last 5 years will be behind a paywall, but anything beyond that is going to be available for free download and open access. So that's one thing. We are in the process of a major overhaul of the entire website and making it far more easily accessible. We are going to need all the help in the world to be able to put in the metadata for each study so that it can all be downloaded and accessed whenever people search for it, so that it will be available. That is happening. So watch this space. I think by next year, the Marg archive at least will be available for free access. Now, I should say that we already have an arrangement with E.J. Brill And anyone who subscribes to EJ Brill in the world already gets the Marg archive de facto for free in their institutions. So all the major universities in the world that subscribe to EJ Brill, for instance, they get Marg for free on their archive already because we are a partner with them. But within India, with JSTOR, there was a long-standing conversation that took place with JSTOR for Marg to be on JSTOR, and they were very keen to have Marg on JSTOR. But at the time, Marg was very skeptical about why they need to be hosted by good Indian nationalists. They were very skeptical about why should an American consortium wish to showcase us and put us online, and why shouldn't there be an Indian equivalent of a JSTOR that should host Marg instead? And so within that conversation somewhere, we ended up neither here nor there. So something that we will try and fix autonomously now. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Shukla.
Thank you.